Hello, and thank you for watching the Final Champion Briefs LD video topic analysis for the year. I'm Daniel Shatskin, editor-in-chief of Champion Briefs LD products, and today we will be exploring the NSDA Nationals topic, an admittedly highly charged and morally complex question. Resolved, violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. This topic cuts across history, philosophy, ethics, modern politics. It demands that we confront hard truths about justice, power, and human suffering. In this video topic analysis, I will try to fairly and thoroughly examine both affirmative and negative positions. We will look at what constitutes political oppression and how much of it is necessary to justify violence, different political perspectives on whether violent resistance is really ever moral. I'll outline a couple of historical examples going all the way back to the Roman Empire, through the American Revolution, French revolutions, all the way up through the Arab Spring. And finally, we'll take a quick minute to reflect on the blurry line between revolution and terrorism, including how violence can disproportionately impact vulnerable groups like women, LGBTQ people, and various other groups that are often both equally oppressed under different regimes, but then left out within the revolution itself. Before we really dive into the arguments, we should try to define some terms, like always in debate. And I'm going to keep these kind of general because there are a lot of different arguments about what each are. So I'm going to try to summarize them. But violent revolution in general refers to a forcible overthrow of a government or system involving physical violence, armed uprisings, assassinations, or civil wars. Several authors create a divide between revolution and rebellion, basically saying that rebellion keeps the same system in place pre and post rebellion, but different leaders functionally, whereas a revolution is a completely different system or form of government that then takes charge. So a lot of times, like military coups in certain countries that are just replacing other dictatorships that just reinstall the same type of dictatorship with a different leader wouldn't necessarily qualify under certain authors' interpretations under the topic because they're not really changing the form of government, they're just changing the leaders of the government, whereas a revolution really changes the entirety of the government and how it operates. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways to define just. In general, you would find it to be like morally right, defensible, or warranted. Political oppression is a really complicated one. And we'll go into the idea of political oppression a little bit more later and what exactly it is. But political oppression refers to systemic injustice by authorities. So censorship, political imprisonment, disenfranchisement, violent suppression of dissent. So peaceful protests always met with force, things like that. The key question really is not whether violent revolution is effective, although that's part of the topic. We should ask whether or not violent revolution actually reaches the means or reaches the end goal that it seeks to achieve. But it's also whether or not it's morally justified as that response to oppression. Effectiveness is part of moral justification, right? If violence never achieves its goal, then it can't really be morally justified. But if there is a way that violence does achieve the goal, then it can be morally justified. So solvency isn't the only question, but it's part of the question that affirmatives have to ask themselves. So let's begin with affirmative cases and the idea of that violent revolution can be a just response to political oppression. There are a lot of different philosophical perspectives that you can tap into here. For example, you have people like John Locke and social contractarians. Locke in particular is probably going to be cited a lot at nationals, based on just how the tournament works and the fact that Locke is a name that kind of most judges are going to be at least vaguely familiar with in the concept of forming the country. You're going to want to take some of these ideas like Locke's social contract and connect it to the American Revolution and the French Revolution and even the Haitian Revolution. And we'll talk about those historical examples in a little bit. But ultimately, Locke argues that government derive legitimacy from the consent of the government governed, or from the allowance of the people. When governments become tyrannical and violate natural rights, to Locke, that was life, liberty, and property. Citizens have the right to revolt, even violently. According to Locke in his second treatise of government, whenever the quote is, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, they put themselves into a state of war with the people. It was these ideas that underpinned our own Declaration of Independence in the United States of America. You can see it within the language of Thomas Jefferson. He basically cribbed John Locke. It's Locke and Payne, sort of reworded. At times, it's Locke and Payne almost word for word. Um, but Locke, generally the typical social contractarian we think of in American political theory. Uh, Frantz Fanon, another theorist, wrote, and I believe it's The Wretched Earth, that how colonial systems dehumanize the oppressed. Uh, for him, violence is like a cleansing force, right? It can wipe away the colonizers, and it's a way for the colonized to reclaim their agency over the colonizers. And I think the quote from Fanon is like, violence is man recreating himself. Obviously, a little patriarchal in that phrasing, but Fanon is talks about violence as a way to basically reclaim human agency and human dignity against a system that removes the humanity and dignity of the oppressed. Uh, Fanon's theories are really interesting. If you are kind of like that one, I'd say check out the brief. There's a really, really good Fanon human dignity affirmative in there. And the evidence for it is really interesting. And Fanon and theorists like Fanon make a really, really interesting argument towards violence being justified against colonizing oppressors. Um, Even people like Martin Luther King would acknowledge the limits on nonviolence, right? King obviously championed nonviolence. In America, he's basically like the American Gandhi, in the idea of like how they championed nonviolence. But King also acknowledged with his quote that, a riot is a language of the unheard, that when systems remain deaf to a peaceful protest and peaceful means and all other options, people are going to feel desperate, and they will end up lashing out like that. It is natural for people to lash out with violence when all other options seem kind of like removed and exhausted. This could even kind of go towards some sort of, like natural humanism type arguments and stuff like that, that like, well, nonviolence may be the first instinct and the best instinct. There just comes a point where there is no more that can happen. And that's kind of where we get to then this threshold for justifying violence, right? And I'm going to first speak about it in the general terms, and then we'll talk about it more specifically when I get to some of these historical examples that kind of support the AF. So, for violence to be just, oppression should be, well, must really be systemic, not incidental, So it has to be codified under the practice of the law functionally that there is this systemic oppression. There should be a suspension or denial of rights for individuals. That again goes beyond just an incidental and accidental cases of it or perceived even cases of it. Like, for example, um, being told happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas is a perceived denial of rights. None of your rights were actually violated at that point. Um, cable news networks not wanting to platform hate speech and hateful ideas, comedy clubs not wanting to platform jokes that may be despicable to club owners, whatever it may be, private or institutions that say we don't want to platform this type of speech. When the marketplace of ideas say we don't like it, that's not really a denial of rights. That's more of everybody else going, we don't want to hear you. You still have a right to say it. We're just going to call you out for saying terrible things or whatever. Or, we were the most inclusive phrase of happy holidays instead of your specific religion. That's not a denial of rights or anything like that. You may be offended by it, but your rights are not actually denied. And then finally, there are no peaceful alternatives or alternatives available. Right, like the state violence is routine, unchecked, and codified to be in place. So think like the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Slaves didn't even have the ability to escape slavery. If they escaped, they became fugitives, and by law, they had to be returned from northern states back into slavery. Stuff like that. So those conditions are kind of debatable on where they are on each one, but it's really important that it's actually a denial of rights and not just you being offended or you being a part of a political minority. It's that you're part of a political minority and that your political minority is legally and routinely like surveilled, criminalized, and uh, shut out from political realms. I think one of the biggest jokes from 2020 that, oh, the election was rigged. The election was rigged. Why did Republicans win so many seats in Congress if the election was rigged? The election really couldn't have been, wasn't rigged. No evidence, actual evidence that has been presented ever in a court has shown that the election was rigged. Random statements that people have made that says the election was rigged is there, but that was a perception. There's no actual evidence that that happened. And evidence to the contrary exists because at the time in 2020, Republicans were a minority party in the House, in the Senate, and the presidency. But they still had a fairly high amount of representation within the government. And then in 2022, Republicans took back the House. And in 2024, they took back the Senate and the presidency. So the idea that, you know, uh, political dissatisfaction with results is the same as oppression really needs to be addressed and squashed. This is really about political oppression and the suppression of ideas. Uh, for the founding of America basically to be based off of political oppression, and then uh, people kind of taking political oppression and weakening it to be when a majority of people in the country disagree with you is not really good. And that's where we can start to go to our historical examples. Colonists in America faced taxation without representation. I hope most of you are familiar, at least, with the story of the American Revolution. There was British military occupation. They occupied American homes, and There was suppression of local governance. So local elected officials were replaced with British officials who were sent from overseas. There were petitions and peaceful protests, but the crown basically ignored all of that, responded with violence, although it's questionable about who started which violent acts first in different situations. Ultimately, the crown was just not giving Americans representation. And at the time, armed revolution was really seen as the only remaining path for self-determination for the colonies. Obviously, Canada figured out how to get self-determination without using violent means. Other British colonies took longer to gain self-determination through nonviolent means, generally speaking. But was violence necessary in the American Revolution? I don't know. Probably if you look at it during the time, Charles was not giving up the colonies. There was no representation for the colonies. And the American Revolution, some would argue, actually spurred the British to treat colonies like Canada different and to give Canada more representation. So without the revolution, the kind of means by which the other former territories and now either crown states or just independent states entirely um, are, the methods they used wouldn't have existed without the American Revolution. If we want to go really, really far back in history, you have like the Servile Wars in ancient Rome. There are actually three Servile Wars. These were major slave uprisings that occurred in the Roman Republic between like the second and first centuries BC. The math for those always kind of gets me screwed up because you count down from BC for BC years as you go further along. So yeah, second to first century BC. So you had like the first Servile War and the second Servile Wars, both of which broke out in Sicily. There were slave rebellions. The most famous of the Servile Wars actually occurs in around like 73 BC. And that's the one that's led by Spartacus, right? Spartacus is a gladiator, and he escaped captivity and organized like over 100,000 or around 100,000 enslaved people, depending on the sources that you read, in what ended up being around a 2-year rebellion. And it actually threatened Rome itself, right? The two previous Servile Wars occurred on the Isle of Sicily. That's the little isle that looks like the ball that the boot is kicking. Um, if you picture Italy as the boot, Sicily's the little thing at the end of it. That's, the island there. Uh, the third Servile War, though, is on the Italian peninsula. And so Spartacus directly threatens Rome. They actually win several battles against Roman legion, and it really exposed an instability and moral crisis that Rome never comes to terms with functionally, right? Rome's reliance on mass enslavement just continues throughout the Roman Empire. And Roman society basically reacts to the three Servile Wars with like fear and repression, but no reform functionally. After the first and second Servile Wars, Rome sent a lot of military force into Sicily. There were mass executions. They really cracked down on enslaved populations, but they viewed it as a local disturbance. And not really a symptom of the systemic injustice of slavery. The third Servile War, which is the Spartacus one in mainland Italy, actually like scared those Roman elites, right? Rebel slaves, like I said, defeated a lot of the legions, and Rome functionally responds with just overwhelming and finally, once they crush this rebellion, just overwhelming and devastating violence. This is where there's 6,000 or so captured rebels that are crucified along the Appian Way. And it's to reassert control, and so that every slave marching into Rome sees the 6,000 crucified slaves. And Rome wants to deter any future slave uprisings. But ultimately, Rome continued to have a slave-based economy. They double down on repression. It kind of eats away at the heart of the empire. They're always having to pull and find new areas to enslave people, and expansion ends up functionally collapsing the empire through a lot of complicated means that we don't have to go into. We want to go into like more modern times with slavery and slave revolutions. You have the Haitian Revolution, where you have enslaved people in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, who overthrew French colonial rule there. And it wasn't just French colonial rule. The Americas kind of supported the French. Lots of different groups kind of supported the French because a slave revolt where black people literally would take over the entirety of the nation was unthinkable to like this era of people. And it was just, think white Southerners in 1790. They were pro-slavery and really, really racist, just as a fact. Going further, you want to look at America. You have like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner was an enslaved preacher in Virginia, so he was moderately educated. He understood the Bible and the teachings of the Bible, and he led an uprising that led to the deaths of around 55 white slaveholders, 55 to 60, depending on different sources. You see a couple of different numbers there. Turner himself thought he was divinely called to strike back against slavery because, let's face it, slavery is an inhumane system, and slaves themselves had no legal or peaceful path to freedom, really. Their only path to freedom was, you know, suddenly their slaveholder finding, morality and saying, wait, slavery is wrong. Absent that happening, they either had to try to escape and everything like that. The rebellion was shut down really, really quickly. But a lot of social scientists would argue that the rebellion begins to put cracks in the system of slavery and really challenge the myth that slavery itself was stable and benevolent, and a system to that was good for the slaves and stuff like that. Turner's rebellion kind of really started to just break that apart. Turner himself is quoted in his confessions, was not Christ crucified, and by signs in the heaven that it would make known to me when I should commence the great work, I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons. And so that's what they did. They used the tools that they had in the field and stuff like that to kill the slave masters. And Turner felt divinely justified in his acts. If you want to go to the Civil War, there's similar feelings. Anti-apartheid militancy in South Africa. You have the ANC, which did preach nonviolence, but then you also had an armed wing of the ANC, and I believe Mandela even once admitted to the fact that, like, yeah, he planned sabotage in those acts, but it was not because of recklessness or anything like that. It was because the fact that there was no other option. Uh, and so that's kind of the pragmatic morality argument, right? Uh, effectiveness really then informs the moral legitimacy of it. If violence ends greater suffering and results in a freer society, then the means are justified, right? Death toll from an action such as continued genocide, slavery, or famine could exceed that of the revolution. Imagine if slavery didn't end at the end of the Civil War. Right. Imagine if there was some peace deal, like in 1863 or 64, before the war ends and slavery continues, right? How many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, would be forced into a system of oppression if the war did not continue, and thousands more died in that war, right? The inaction sometimes is worse. Telling people that they need to stay in systems of oppression is just like what how do you do that? Um, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about here on the negative for a second. So you have people like Gandhi who argued for principled nonviolence. Gandhi held that means and ends are really inseparable, right? And using violence to attain justice only breeds cycles of retribution. Uh, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, is I believe the Gandhi quote. And so the violence uh, when you use violence to attain justice, it's just going to create another cycle of violence against it, and it keeps going and keeps going and keeps going, and it never ends. And there are a lot of really good examples of that in the real world. You know, for if you want to look at several different conflicts that are cycles of violence, in it are these principles of oppression and fighting oppression. And so Gandhi's principled nonviolence makes a really strong case against violence ever being justified. Uh, Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have people like Hobbes or Immanuel Kant, who would argue that like the state itself is inviolable, and you can't rise against the state. Hobbes would do it more on just a security justification. Kant would talk about it on like morality, depending on universal principles. If everyone responded to oppression with violence, society would collapse into anarchy because government is inherently coercive force, and somebody somewhere is going to feel oppression in some level. And so where do you draw the line on it? If any level of oppression if one level of oppression justifies violence, then any level of oppression justifies violence, and that means we get anarchy. On a More on a discussion of power, similar to Gandhi's principled nonviolence, would be like Hannah Arendt. And Arendt would argue that violence functionally destroys legitimate power, right? Well, you can overthrow a regime, it rarely builds a sustainable or just replacement. Revolutions will go to tyranny, or think like the French Reign of Terror, or like Stalinism and the purges that happened in Stalin. Most of these arguments kind of rely on three different perspectives. The first is like moral relativism. If we justify violence based on a subjective experience of oppression, it starts to become difficult to draw a line, right? Extremist groups can co-opt this reasoning, and they then justify their acts of terrorism. This is kind of like January 6th, right? They've co-opted the reason that in Lock and Pain, and say that they are oppressed, and storm the Capitol, and it results in police officers being beaten. There's also like a cycle of violence, like we talked about with the Russian Revolution and Stalin's purges. It led to a civil war, then there were purges. The Iranian Revolution uh, replaced, a military dictatorship under the Shah with a theocratic dictatorship. Still a dictatorship, but a completely different kind of dictatorship. Um, you know, these things happen over and over again. If you want to look at the Arab Spring, we're not really quite sure what's occurred at the end result of Syria, but Syria was a destabilizing that kind of started during the Arab Spring and lasted well outside of it. Um, you have democratic backsliding, violent upheavals that destabilize civil institutions, where you end up getting failed states with power vacuums and different warlords. Think like post-Gaddafi Libya and post-Saddam Iraq and Syria, right? Where there was a revolution, it was shut down, but then there was a democratic backslide, and then the institutions fully destabilized. And over like 10 years, finally, the Assad regime completely collapsed. And now we have a former Al Qaeda guy running Syria. Not really sure how that's going to work out. So there's a lot of crazy things that can happen there. The unintended, unpredicted consequences. And so the ends not really being the predicted ends of your means. And then there's also the argument that alternative paths could exist, right? There's civil disobedience, which, while still violating laws, doesn't actually commit acts of violence. So think about things like within the civil rights movements with sit-ins and, Rosa Parks sitting in the front of the bus. Rosa Parks, by the way, was not the first person to do that. She was the planned plant to do that. So that they can then make the lawsuit. That's a whole other story. But still notable for the act, the bravery of it, knowing the ridicule she was going to face. There's digital resistance and whistleblowing. You had in the Arab Spring, a lot of the resistance occurred online and planning occurred online and in the digital space. Same thing with the Iranian protests, both during I think it was the Green Revolution, which was ultimately quashed and stuff like that. But there are ways to kind of put things out there. And while these paths are slow, they aim for more long-term stability without costs of bloodshed. One of the arguments with the Civil War is that it forced integration on a nation that wasn't ready for it. I don't think that's a strong enough argument to say that people should have been remained enslaved, or that the Jim Crow laws that resulted at post-Civil War are at all justified. They're not. But that's one of those arguments, is that the cost of bloodshed that occurred to end a certain type of oppression didn't actually result in a long-term stable situation. And then in final point, very quickly, I want to just talk about a couple of different things. First, where do we draw the line between revolutionary violence and terrorism? Terrorism targets civilians to induce fear for political gain. Revolutionary violence often targets symbols of power, right? Police stations, military outposts, but it sometimes crosses the line. Uh, when violence becomes indiscriminate, moral justification collapses. I am all for a Palestinian state. The actions of Hamas on October 7th undermine that argument. There is no way that you can do that. Just as the actions, by the way, from Israel in its defense can undermine its own justifications for how it defends itself, right? This is not a one side good, one side bad. Both sides can do wrong. Both sides can also be justified. The Palestinian people are likely justified in wanting to resist and have a greater say in the government. But when they attack civilian populations, that's where indiscriminate attacks collapse a lot of the moral justification that exists. Terrorism is not just, by the way, isolated to the Middle East. If you want to look at situations in Northern Ireland and how terrorism between Protestants and Catholics was used by both sides targeting civilians in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of really good evidence there. Algeria, bombs in public spaces. You in South America, there have been terrorist actions. You have groups like the Zapatistas, who formerly performed acts of violence, who in later years renounced violence because they felt that the justification and the morality of their movement collapsed through the violence. Uh, and then I want to talk about something that's a little uncomfortable, admittedly, and that's gender-based violence. It's tragic and it's often overlooked as a consequence of uprisings. During conflict, rape is frequently used as a weapon of war. Women are generally excluded from leadership in a lot of post-revolutionary societies despite their involvement within the revolutions. Uh, for example, in Syria, there are many female activists and women militias and like that, but they faced undue torture and sexual violence if they were captured compared to their male compatriots. Women in general in these areas, even if they were non not non-combatants, right, generally face forms of sexual violence much higher in combat zones than outside of combat zones. Even in oppressive regimes where the oppression can harm women and, maybe forms of patriarchal oppression, the violence of revolution can make that work worse if the revolution is not one that is focused on liberation for all. And they could actually deepen a lot of those hierarchies and make them worse, which is why a lot of feminist authors warn that justifying any form of revolution without addressing patriarchal structures within governments and that like societies and systems will just create new injustice and perpetuate the same types of violence that they often want to avoid. And so, where do we stand here? Violent revolution may sometimes be just, but probably only under extreme oppression. When all peaceful options have failed, when care is taken to limit harm, when the targets are really targets of power and not civilians. Um, it's likely a tragic choice. It's not a triumphant one, right? You don't want to be waving a flag about choosing political violence, right? Political violence is the last resort option for an oppressed people. And whether that means an affirmative ballot or not is how far that goes, right? Does the affirmative have to prove that violent revolution is justified for all political oppression or just some in order to win the ballot? And that's going to be the limits debate that will be very, very hard to kind of win on either side, especially when you're talking about issues like slavery and governments that are repressive and totalitarian. Um, so, as you consider your research on this topic, remember that the question isn't just, is violent revolution just, but is the violence committed in the revolution just? So, are you just in revolution and just at revolution? Similar to just in war and just at war, the two same kind of concepts. And then also, is it the only way that we can build societies where violent revolution then isn't necessary? Can we do it without violent revolution? Is violent revolution undermining the ultimate goal that these revolutions are trying to seek in liberating oppressed people? The debates at NSDA Nationals are not easy. You're going to be debating in front of diverse audiences with different opinions. Using a clear cause action result. The British didn't let Americans talk for themselves in Parliament. They had no vote. Parliament kept putting taxes on the American people. The American people were oppressed. They had a revolution. Parliament never let them have a voice, right? You have causes, actions, results, right? The American people enslaved Black people in this country. Black people had no right to freedom in this country for the longest period of time. There was no recourse. They had no way to gain their freedom. Slave revolts. However, you decide to approach the topic with humanity first. Philosophy supports the human story. Good luck, and I hope you have an amazing time at NSDA Nationals in Iowa.